Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligence Institute, and I'm joined once again by my amazing co-host, Meghan Day, Strategy Leader here at Diligent. Meghan, how are you today?
I am doing well, Dottie. Happy spring.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we're not going into nuclear winter, given what's happening around the world, but, all good.
Okay. So I feel like we would be, listen, folks, we know this is not a political show. We will continue not to be a political show, but honestly, we here at Diligent care deeply about secured messaging. And I don't think that we can possibly not talk about the fact that we have, oh my gosh, like all the leaders in defense of the U.S. using Signal. Why are they using Signal, Meghan?
Well, I was going to say the New York Times had a great little write-up in their daily newsletter that they do this morning about the secure rooms, if you will, some of these folks have access to. And that put a lot into perspective for me, but you can't undersell it. I was laughing at the context. It's like you can't scroll Instagram and also, do this communication the way that we have all gotten used to. Like the phone has become attached to our souls in a lot of ways, and it's how we all operate. It's an extension of ourselves for most people. And so sometimes you don't give that a second thought.
That's it. I mean, and like, not to mention the fact that they're using this app, they've agreed to whatever the user agreement is. It's a free app. And quite frankly, they don't know who's listening in. I mean, they certainly know that there was a reporter from The Atlantic listening in. Now they know. But frankly, China's probably listening in. Russia's probably listening in. I mean, these apps, these, off-the-shelf apps that are not meant to be secured, they're not designed to be locked down. They are just so imminently hackable. And that's the part that really chills me is, guys, get your act together. Use the right app. Use Diligent Messenger for crying out loud. Like, use something that is secured and purpose-built to keep your messages away from people you don't want reading them. I mean, goodness grief. I mean, what? You just don't have enough emojis in those apps? What's the issue here? I don't understand, Meghan. Sorry, I'm off my soapbox, people, but I just can't let that one go.
It just brings up a lot of questions. I mean, we are used to instant feedback, sending things, when it comes to us. You want to have that type of conversation and that flow when you are discussing important things. Like we live in this very mobile, disconnected or decentralized world, I should say. And so it's hard to get everybody in the same room together to have those conversations, not to defend their choices by any stretch of the imagination, but yeah, I could see this happening a lot. There's a lot we don't know about, probably.
Well, there's a lot we clearly are going to be knowing about because if they keep accidentally including reporters, we're going to learn everything. Listen, this relates so beautifully to the conversation that you had for our podcast today, Meghan. You had the opportunity to speak to one of our newest colleagues, Kristy Grant-Hart, who's the Vice President and Head of Advisory Services at Spark Compliance, which is now a Diligent brand. We're delighted to have her on board. And you had the opportunity to talk to her about the way the compliance profession is changing and talk about compliance. Talk about not being in compliance.
Well, Johnny, it just like you saying that right now just has me almost in stitches because I am envisioning like senior members of our government going through like the little compliance training widgets that like we all have to go to on a regular basis.
And just hitting ignore.
Yes, I don't know. It makes me laugh. I might not be laughing, but
laughing sort of like gallows humor style of laughing, I think is really where we are right now. Well, listen, before we get to DEFCON 3, let's listen to your interview with Kristy Grant-Hart, and maybe we can come back and talk a little bit about how to apply some of the lessons she shared with members of our federal government.
Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Kristy Grant-Hart. Kristy is the Vice President and Head of Advisory Services at Spark Compliance, a Diligent brand. Kristy is also an author and former CEO and CCO. Kristy, welcome to the show and welcome to the Diligent team.
Thank you. Could I be more excited? I don't think so. It's so much fun. We're about 7 weeks in now to our diligent relationship, and I couldn't be happier with it.
Love it. Well, let's find out a little bit more about yourself, about Spark Compliance.
Sure. So I am a former FCPA defense attorney, worked on a couple of corporate monitorships with the law firm of Gibson Dunn. 2011, they moved me to London to work on a LIBOR financial services investigation. I ended up marrying a Brit and staying. So I became a director of compliance for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, handled 100 countries, and then became a chief compliance officer at the joint venture of Paramount and Universal Pictures. Again, 65 countries managing that. And then 9 years ago, started Spark Compliance. We're a consulting and training company that 7 or 8 weeks ago was acquired by Diligence. So I couldn't be more pleased to be part of this Diligent journey.
Well, I feel like we could probably have a whole episode on FCPA and what is happening there, but want to open up the lens a little bit and talk about what you think are some of the biggest compliance risks facing businesses today. What are some things they might be not be thinking about at the company level? What can we be doing to better wrap our arms around compliance risk?
Well, I think that the biggest risk right now is just the uncertainty and the chronic changing that is happening constantly. It's very difficult to execute a well thought out plan when those plans get jumped out the window every 24 hours. But in terms of things that I think people aren't paying enough attention to, besides putting out those fires and responding to them, I don't think that there's enough focus on what's happening in the modern slavery, human trafficking, due diligence space. There are more and more transparency requirements if we're looking at, Canada with $250,000 fines if you get it wrong. There's also all the things happening in Europe with the different transparency directives, as well as the Forced Labor Prevention Act that's going to stop products going in to Europe, the European Union, if there's forced labor thought that may be part of their supply chain. So huge amounts there. And the second thing I think is really under the radar is the local AI regulations. So people know about the EU AI Act typically, but because the federal US government isn't jumping in and is unlikely to, what we're actually seeing is states and even cities jumping in. And so you end up with all of these various requirements for disclosure, including things like, I believe it's Chicago, if you use AI in human resources recruiting, you have to post about it and tell everyone. And there can be individual fines for not. So I think that trying to get your head around not just the big, but the small AI regulation pieces is incredibly challenging right now.
Well, that certainly gives us a lot to talk about. And tied into that, we recently published a survey of U.S. public company board directors, our What Directors Think report, which we do in partnership with corporate board member and FTI Consulting. And in that survey, we noticed, though, that regulatory compliance ranked relatively low on the list of company priorities for this year, and also low on the list of items directors wanted to discuss at their next board meeting. Where is the love for compliance? What is your take on this, Kristy?
Well, I think the first question mark is what do they mean by regulatory compliance? Because if you're looking at the same types of regulations that you've been complying with for year on year, say you're in financial services or insurance or in healthcare, then maybe that isn't as important as the more global compliance and ethics that includes things like culture, investigations, those types of pieces, conflicts of interest management, where they can actually be very, very problematic if you're not paying attention to them because of what they tell you about the culture and how your company is going. And I mean, look, to a certain degree, it makes sense, right? But the minute you get those executive orders in and suddenly people are responding to chaos, then I think that might have changed the answers, perhaps depending on when you had this survey done. But ultimately, culture is a major driver of business profitability and talent retention. So if you aren't paying attention to what's going on in the compliance world and certainly how it affects your own company, I think that that's not a great way of approaching things from a director or C-suite member.
In that same survey, we also asked directors about mitigating bribery and corruption risk in their supply chain. Only 65% of respondents said their company had implemented ethics and employee training. 60% had regular audits, and almost a quarter, 22%, said they didn't know whether their company had any action in this regard. What is your reaction on this? How can boards really ensure their company is mitigating bribery and corruption in their supply chain and, heck, in their organization, given the state of the United States right now?
Oh my. So look, I think part of this is the word supply chain. So if we're talking about the whole breadth of the supply chain, there frequently aren't a lot of high risk suppliers. And so to a certain degree, if you're just looking and using a risk-based approach throughout the whole supply chain, it might not be necessary. Now, if those companies aren't vetting distributors, resellers, consultants that are opening new markets, then that's crazy. So I think to a certain degree, it depends on what you're actually looking at. But the training number is what's baffling to me because anti-bribery training is really pretty basic for most companies, and especially if even if it's stuffed into the code of conduct training that you get, that's 5 minutes of that is dealing with bribery or anti-bribery. That is a shockingly low number to me. In terms of what I would tell companies, that training, if you don't have any of it, it truly is it's indefensible. So even if at this, and by indefensible, I mean to a prosecutor, regulator, somebody looking at your program, even to potentially your customers or the people that you're serving, that it will be indefensible to them as well. The fact of the matter is, training is pretty much ground zero. So the fact that you have as many people doing regular audits, that 60% is actually higher than I would anticipate, because a lot of companies don't put that kind of money and effort in. But not having training is just baffling. I mean, we just saw that despite what's happening in the federal government, US, the state AGs are
Mm.
enforcing bribery laws. And recently, UK, France, and Switzerland announced a joint task force for anti bribery. So, not doing the training is very, very short sighted at the least.
It seems like that is something you can easily tick the box for. Not that compliance is a check the box exercise, but as you said, it is such a foundational piece of having a strong program and practice inside your organization. So we also asked directors which personas outside the CEO and CFO they wanted to hear from more in board meetings. And Christy, unfortunately, Chief Compliance Officer ranked pretty low on that list. This aligns what we hear from compliance leaders anecdotally too, that they sometimes feel neglected by their boards or not given the time or resources they need. What advice would you give to directors to ensure that compliance leaders are heard? And in reverse, what would you give advice to compliance leaders to advocate for themselves?
I would advocate that this survey is very sad um, in terms of the outcomes of it. I would remind directors of their personal responsibility under many laws, as well as the reputational issues that come if they face compliance meltdowns on their watch. I think a lot of the challenge, though, does come from that second question, which is what can compliance officers do better? There is a tendency in our industry to report on what you are doing, which is your activities. No one cares what your activities are. And especially boards of directors, they don't want a litany of what you've been up to. They want to understand forward looking risk, not just backwards looking risk. So the more that people can be that strategic partner, which I think it's an overused phrase, but it's a real one. If you can get into forward facing risk and storytelling about what's happening and what's coming, that makes you much more interesting to listen to than if you are backwards looking and reporting on activities.
That's great advice. We also tend to hear from board members that they struggle to oversee culture in their organizations. Any tips for directors on improving their oversight in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the DOJ, when it came out with its update to the evaluation guidelines for corporate compliance programs, it really up to the bar in saying that boards need to understand culture. And that's a really hard ask, to be fair, right? These people don't go to work every day on the ground and see what everyone is saying, but they're responsible for it regardless. And so, by the way, I've written a white paper about this topic. If you want a link to it, happy to have you have it. Because there isn't one specific input that tells you what's happening in culture. What it really is a mix of subjective and objective points of view. So it can be things like exit interview data, it can be culture surveys, whistleblower statistics, focus groups. There's all sorts of ways of understanding what's happening with the culture. So if I were the board, the directors, I would tell the compliance officer, go get that information, synthesize it, and tell me what the trends are, because I don't have time to look at all these data points, nor can I put them all in context. So compliance officers can do a great service for the board by putting together a plan and monitoring how these different metrics are behaving.
Love that idea. Any best and final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, look, compliance doesn't seem important until it's the only thing when you're responding to big problems, right? And that sometimes happens with investigations, whether that's a regulatory investigation or whether it's an internal investigation. But the thing is, compliance does still matter, even in this environment. Fines and statute of limitations, reputational damage, they're all still out there. So please make sure you're still paying attention.
Definitely. Well, Kristy, before we wrap, we have a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests. The first is, what do you believe will be the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
I think it's going to be how information is synthesized. So, live dashboards, live monitoring, live metrics, I think will be much more part of the conversation. So, it's less big board books with lots of different pieces of information that they're reading in PDF format or something like that, and actually looking at more live data to talk about what's happening in real time.
Love that. What was the last thing you read, watched, or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
So I don't know if everyone listening has seen the HBO Max program Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic. But I'm rewatching it now, partially as it with the viewpoint of being a former CEO of a small company, now part of a big one, and just how scrappy they are, but how much they need real CEO leadership when you become a bigger company, and the directors being a couple of sort of you know, hangers on versus
Yes.
actually having big directors who understand what they're doing and have a background in it. I really watching it again from that perspective has been pretty fascinating to say we really do need, the adults in the room, as it were, to be running the ship because it matters.
I love that. Well, Kristy, what is your current passion project?
So 2 years ago, I took up the aerial silks.
Oh,
So
wow.
hanging from the ceiling like a circus performer, Cirque du Soleil style. I go 3 times a week. I did my first performance at a recital. I had 12 people come support me. It is the best when you're hanging upside down, 16 feet in the air. You can't think about anything else, and that is a really good way of being.
I love that. Sounds like a welcome distraction right now for sure. Well, Kristy, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Meghan, thank you so much for that interview with Kristy. First of all, how much do you just love Kristy's energy? She's
So
just so
great.
phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, she's just
And
the best.
you know what? I think it flips on its head a little bit. The average expectation for a compliance executive, chief compliance officer, she brings a lot of energy. She brings a lot of strategic thinking. And I think to some of the things that we talked about, a lot of people overlook that is hugely valuable for your compliance leadership.
Hugely valuable. And also, from a strategic lens, right? Like looking at compliance as a strategic asset for the company. I think too often boards and audit committees kind of look at compliance as the people we must bring in a few times a year to check some boxes, or if something goes wrong, that we drag them in to help us figure out how to get out of the mess. But frankly, there's a lot of ways to sort of look at compliance through a different lens. And Kristy's a really good example of people who are doing that. She's kind of looking out across the landscape to understand what are some of the things that are coming up next, and how do we need to make sure that the company is positioned well to address them and to deal with them. And how do we just make sure that we keep everybody safe and doing the right things? I mean, that's really, at the end of the day, that's sort of the name of the game of compliance. But also, I have to say, Meghan, Kristy's a perfect example. Every time I would go to our annual user conference, I would find myself gravitating to the compliance sessions. And you might think, why aren't they the driest? Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no. These people have the best stories because they have the stories of the people who do the wrong things and how they got it cleaned up and what came as a result. And it's like walking into a Grisham novel, into every one of those sessions. It is so fun. And they are often some of the people with the best senses of humor.
That's been a theme in this episode. I feel like sometimes that sense of humor, carries us through these tough situations.
I think it's got to.
I was going to say, and maybe hanging upside down is part of the trick too. Maybe we all need to embrace some aerial yoga, aerial gymnastics.
Aerial yoga. Yes, I know. I really wanted to say to her, like, Pixar didn't happen. I got to see the aerial yoga. I mean, it sounds incredible. It sounds incredible. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. I'd like to say a few special thank yous. First and foremost, to our brilliant compliance expert, Kristy Grant-Hart, podcast producers, Kira Ciccarelli, Steve Clayton, and Laura Klein. Our sponsors for the show, PwC, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, and Meridian Compensation Partners. And most especially, thank you to Diligent for continuing to sponsor this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. 5 stars only, please. You can also listen to our episodes and see more from the Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.